5 months and around 100 hours of work, my version of Glinda's new bubble dress from Wicked for Good is complete. This was a huge project and there's a lot to talk about, so this video is just going to be for the skirt, and I'll be uploading videos too for the bodice and the accessories later. I really love the costuming in Wicked so much. This is the third costume I've made now, starting with the pink bubble dress which I made last year. I did a kind of easier version of this since I made it before we really had any good quality photos of the dress, and I have a few YouTube Shorts tutorials on how I did that one. That one's relatively easy for beginners, and just as a heads up, unlike that dress, this tutorial is really not a beginner project. If you're looking for an easier Wicked costume to do, I also made the Ozdos dress. And again, I have some YouTube Shorts tutorials for that. As I said, this one's relatively beginner friendly. It looks hard, but it's actually a really simple pattern, and the fabric dyeing is pretty straightforward as well. I put a lot more work into the Ozdos dress than that pink bubble dress, and it was so rewarding, and that made me decide to get as close to a replica of the real dress for this project. I do want to say that it's not an exact replica. For one thing, when I was making this, we didn't have any good quality photos of the beading and almost no photos of the sides and the back of the dress, so I kind of had to wing it with a lot of beading. I also made a few changes just to save money and time, but I am going to talk about what those changes were as I go along. One thing I would say is if you're making this, you might hear me talk about silk organza and think that's going to be an easy place to save some money by just using poly organza instead. I would really recommend against that. If you're going to splurge on one thing on this dress, it should be the organza. This skirt involves precisely dyeing organza as well as applying heat transfer vinyl to it. If you get poly fabric, it melts so easily, the dyeing's not going to work. If you can't get silk organza, I'd recommend finding some organza or chiffon that already has a colour gradient on them, and then for the swirls you could just find some like swirly sequin tulle or something like that to use instead. So layer 1. I chose to use this purple Duchess satin for my lining, mainly because I wanted to use that satin for the bodice. That's just my favourite fabric for bodices. It's really nice and flattering and I wanted them to match. It doesn't matter too much though. At this point the colour is more important. So I know that the tulle layer of this skirt is definitely purple. So I wanted to colour match that just to create a nice uniform canvas for the other fabrics to sit on top of. So this layer is just a simple full circle skirt. I wanted to put all of my skirt layers onto one waistband as well, so I've left that until the end, but it just has a regular rolled hem. And for the closure, my preferred method is to just leave a 5 or 6 inch gap at the top of one of the side seams. The gap won't be visible at the end because all of the layers are going on top anyway. So this is my original idea for the tulle. I didn't end up going with this, which I'll explain why, but this is just a much easier method. So on top of that purple lining, I had these 3 different colours of tulle in pink, blue and purple. I bought 40-yard bolts of each colour, and I basically just unrolled the bolt and cut long rectangles that were just the approximate length of my skirt. And then I did a gathering stitch along the top edge and just added those all around the waistband to kind of create this nice multicoloured look. So this is how that turns out if you just keep layering it up. Problem I had was that I'm putting white silk organza on top of this, which is kind of more opaque than I expected, and it did lighten up the colours quite a bit. Basically, if you do this method, you're going to want to choose tulle colours that are darker and more vibrant than what you actually want. So like, if you get a darker blue with the white organza on top, it'll overall look like a light blue. I just wasn't expecting it to change the colour that much, but around the same time I found this photo of the dress. The way that she's moving, it's actually revealed some of the layers of the dress. So you can actually see this layer of tulle coming out here, and it's just a solid purple. So at that point I was going to get new tulle anyway. I decided to just go for accuracy instead now that I had a better idea of what was going on. And that photo reveals the other layers too, so you can also see this here, which is like a dark blue. This is silk chiffon, which has been dyed to get all the different colours that you see in the dress, but I'll go back to that in a moment. You can also see that outer organza layer, which is definitely white. Back to the tulle. Now I know it's just plain purple, I bought a 40-yard bolt of purple tulle in as close to a shade as the one in that photo as I could find. So as for putting this on the dress, if you've ever sewn with tulle before, you'll know it's really hard to do the seams in a way that looks neat and nice. I really didn't want these visible seams in my tulle, so I tried out doing it a different way. I knew I was going to use the entire 40 yards. I was going to end up with a bunch of layers anyway, and I wanted it to be made out of full circle skirts again. So the way I did this was I basically cut out a bunch of half circle skirts and I just staggered them around the waistband, so a new half circle started every few inches or so. There are no gaps in the tulle, and the result of that is this really nice seamless tulle look, and you really can't tell that it's made out of so many pieces. With the tulle layer complete, it's time to do the dyed layer of the dress. So this photo here is really great for seeing different colours and the way that they are positioned. It's kind of done in a way that you could really only achieve with fabric dyeing or custom printed fabric. So just to go back to that previous photo that showed all the layers off, I do think that it's silk chiffon that is dyed. I ended up using silk organza instead just because I could get it for a bit cheaper than the chiffon, and I didn't think it made much of a difference to the end result. So I think you can use either, but I used organza. And then going back to this photo, I used this to kind of draw out a diagram based on all the images I've seen of what I think the kind of dye pattern is. So this is my diagram. The F&B is just for front and back. If you've ever dyed fabric before, you'll probably see the potential issue here, and that is, how do you dye a pattern like this? That's not something you could achieve in a boiling pot, and that's one of the reasons that using silk fabric is really important for this, because natural fibres don't need boiling water for dyes to work, and that makes them really easy to dye with patterns like this. So I had actually recently dyed my Padme lake dress from Star Wars using a method I've seen a few people do, which is basically mixing hot water with dye in spray bottles, and then with that fabric hung up, you can spray your design right onto it, and thanks to the natural fibres, it takes the dye really well, and you get this lovely controlled gradient. I figured I could use the same method for Glinda. I did do it a little bit differently, so because the colours needed to be a lot more vibrant, having learned that from the whole tulle thing, and they also needed to be compact, I really didn't want gravity to make them drip into each other. So I decided to just get some waterproof table mats and set those down, lay my skirt on top and just spray it whilst it was on the ground. But before we get onto the actual dyeing, we need to choose the colours. So this is from one of the posters, and it kind of stands out because it looks like it's really had the saturation turned up for some reason, but it makes the colours really vibrant. And as I mentioned before, there's this layer of white silk organza going on top, which is really going to lighten up the colours underneath. And for that reason, I wanted to make sure this layer was darker and more vibrant than I actually wanted it to look. And that poster with the vibrancy turned up, I basically based my dye colours on the colours from that because I figured it would lighten to how the dress really looks. So these are the dye colours I used. Again, I'll link these in the description. First of all, I just made up a circle skirt, again out of the white silk organza, and I hemmed the bottom before I dyed it. I just wanted to make sure to avoid any fraying during the dye process, and again I just left a little gap at the top of one of the side seams for the closure. You do want to sew it up before dyeing really, so you don't have to worry about matching the dye up to the side seams, etc. To dye it, I folded the front in half, basically to ensure that both sides were going to be an exact mirror of each other, and the dye will just soak through to the other half, so it'll save you a bit of time as well. And then I just got hot water in my spray bottles, mixed a bit of dye in, just eyeballing it, and then I just went to town spraying the design on. I had my diagram from before out in front of me just for reference as I did it. I found it easiest to do the blue circles first, and then I just went around the edges with my pink and purple dyes. I also went back in and just saturated the blue areas with more dye at the end as well. You want to work relatively fast so that the different colour dyes actually blend together. I just let it sit for a few hours before I hung it up outside. Thankfully it was a nice sunny day, so it didn't take that long to dry, and then I just did the same process with the back half. Going back to this photo again, I think the order of the real dress is it has the lining, tulle on top, then the dyed layer, and then there's this white silk organza layer which has the swirls on it. I used a bit of a different method for my swirls. Mine are quite opaque. That meant I ended up changing the order of my layers because though my swirls are opaque, putting the multicoloured organza layer on top of the swirls kind of gives the illusion that they are. Anyway, I didn't decide to do that until my layers were all made and ready to be put together, so that did mean I had expected there to be this layer of white organza on top of the dyed layer, which would lighten the colours, and there wasn't in the end. So if you really want an accurate dress, either put that dyed layer under the swirl layer, or just don't dye it with such vibrant colours. That being said, I absolutely love the colour that my skirt turned out. I do think it's more vibrant than the real dress, but I just really love how it looks, so I'm not mad about it. It was a happy outcome, but it's just something to keep in mind if you do want accuracy. Onto the swirl. So as mentioned before, this is a layer of white silk organza which has the swirl on it. So first of all, what are the swirls made of? At the time that I made this dress, we didn't have any close-up high quality photos, so I was working off of just blurry looks like this. So from what I could tell, there are these kind of irregular shapes. They look shiny and iridescent in some areas, but not necessarily all of them. But they're kind of iridescent like the sequins on the bodice. But the irregular shape makes me think that they weren't sequins, at least not any you could easily source. But I thought it also looked like there was something else, like chunky glitter in between them. But luckily, right as I was in the middle of editing this video, some photos dropped that give a much better look at the swirls. So this is interesting because you can see that it does have those kind of irregular shapes I mentioned, but they look like that because there's two materials going on here. So from what I can tell, so it kind of looks to me like they've got some kind of glitter fabric that's just got really like chunky and condensed glitter, and they've either stitched or sewn that on to get the shape of these swirls, and then there are like different sizes of flat iridescent sequins stitched on top of that. Or it could just be like a fully custom made fabric and that's just directly printed onto the organza, I don't know. But just as like an alternative that you could do at home quite easily, you can get this stuff. This is bonding powder. It's like little flecks of glue that come out of almost like a salt shaker that you would be able to sprinkle over your fabric in the shape of those swirls. And then you could use a foil on top, like this one. It's a very thin layer of foil which is attached to a clear cellophane sheet. You would place it on top of the glue, put a sheet of baking paper over it to avoid damaging it, iron that, let it cool, peel the cellophane off, and it should leave behind a similar kind of scattered effect. And then to finish it off, you can go in and using different sizes of these flat sequins, you can hand sew these over the top. So all of that being said, I do think it's a much more time consuming method than what I did. So I personally didn't want to do anything that was going to involve sewing loads of individual sequins onto the swirls because it would take forever. To cut back on how long this was going to take, I decided to use heat transfer vinyl instead. I zoomed in and drew out some similar bubble-like shapes and turned this into an SVG file that I could cut out on my Cricut machine. I did 2 different widths of these bubbles because the real dress seemed to have 2 widths. And I actually made this file available on my Etsy store if you're interested. I ended up needing about 5 meters of a 30cm wide roll of HDB to cover the entire swirl pattern. I do want to say, I know I said this was less time consuming than doing sequins, but it still took me about 15 hours of work to apply all of this vinyl, so that is something to keep in mind. It is a lot of work. Basically, I didn't want to waste a bunch of vinyl, so I didn't make a file that was already swirled. I just made these long rows of it so that I could just cut out small sections and apply it to the organza layer just a bit at a time to slowly form the big swirl. And as mentioned before, this is also why the silk fabric is so important. If you try to use poly organza, the odds of accidentally melting it during this process are so high. As I said, it took me 15 hours to do this. If you use poly, it will take even longer. Silk fabric doesn't melt, so it works much better than that for HDB. As for the type of HDB, I did find this stuff by Cricut, which is like transparent and iridescent, which I thought would work great, but it was really expensive and they didn't have much in stock anyway. I'll link it in the description, but keep that in mind. I do think it would have worked really nice, so I bought 2 rolls of it to test. I did find that it looked really different depending on which side of the vinyl was face up, and the wrong side up I actually thought looked quite a lot nicer. But since I was going to cut all my vinyl into small pieces anyway, I did still cut out those 2 rolls and incorporate them into my swirls just because I didn't want to waste it. I thought it would be nice to have some iridescent parts at least. But for most of them, I just used standard white HDB. And with the dyed layer on top, I think it still looks pretty nice. But anyway, onto the swirl itself. Again, I don't think this is totally accurate because I did it before we had photos of all the angles, but using what we did have, I drew this swirl out just using the graphic app on my iPad. I did the best I could. It took quite a while, but you don't have to because this template is also on my Etsy store. So if you buy that, you'll get a file that can be printed out, which means you have to tape it all together, and that requires a lot of paper because it is a big design. I didn't really want to do that, so I've also included a projector file, which really made the process so much easier if you have a projector. You do need quite a good amount of floor space to do this, and calibrating the projector is a bit of a pain because it's such a large area, but it is doable. I basically projected the template and I spread out my organza skirt, lining it up with the projection. One thing that made this easier was doing it on carpet, because I stuck pins through the skirt and into the carpet itself to hold everything in place. You could use pattern weights too, but I knew I was going to end up just crawling all over this in order to apply the vinyl, so pinning it down worked best for me. As for applying the actual vinyl, this isn't going to work too well on an ironing board just because of how massive it is. You could trace out the template using some kind of erasable pen, but just obviously not a heat erase one. I found it was easier to just do it straight on the floor, but you do need to take certain precautions to avoid melting your carpet. Ask me how I know. I found the best way was to lay out a bunch of towels underneath and then a layer of greaseproof paper, which I just taped together to keep in place on top. Since the silk organza is sheer, your HTV can basically glue the organza to whatever is underneath, so you want the greaseproof paper because that will just peel right off of it. So get that set up, pin the organza on top and get the projection on. I did this over a couple of evenings because it was much easier to see the lines when it was getting dark. And I just got out my mini heat press and I just started cutting up pieces of vinyl and applying. Smaller sections are better to get the look of a smoother curve, but it is time consuming, so I did as many big sections in one go as I could get away with. You do need to be careful not to put your heat press or iron directly onto the vinyl already applied, or you'll melt it. I also found the iridescent vinyl needed more time to cool before I could peel the transfer plastic off. I found it was easiest to just go from one side and make my way over to the other. I did about a quarter at a time because that was just what worked best with the space that I had. So mine looks like it has gaps in it, but that's just because of the iridescent vinyl. Once the skirt is flipped the other way around, you can see it all looks completely white and matches. If you're using my pattern, you need to gather the waist. I tried to gather it in between the sections of vinyl so the actual vinyl could sit flat. So just putting the layers together, I've got the lining, the tulle, the swirl layer, and now the dyed layer on top of that. And then here's how that all looks together, but there is still one layer to go. So you can see that there is a layer on top of the organza because you can see there's lines where a fabric is folding over on itself, but the swirl underneath is unaffected. Based on videos of her in the dress, you can see it's really sparkly. So that layer is also not hemmed. That makes me think it's glitter tulle. So I bought this stuff, which is the most sparkly glitter tulle I've ever found, which again will be linked below. It's really great because the sparkle even shows up on camera, which I find is quite rare. I bought 10 yards of that because it only came in 5 or 10, but that's fine anyway because I wanted to make this circle skirt wider at the waist so it could be gathered. So I just made it as large a waist as I could using the width of fabric, which was 12 inches I think, and because of the length of the skirt that was the biggest I could do, and that just gets gathered to fit the waist. And I actually hand stitched the seams because, as mentioned earlier, seams and tulle are so hard to get right. On a machine they just always seem to have too high attention for me and looks bad, so by hand was the best option for me. And then it's tulle, so it doesn't need hemming. I just stitched all the layers down onto the previous skirt one at a time, so mine is lining, purple tulle, swirl layer, dyed layer, and then the glitter tulle on top. And once that's done, you can add a waistband. I made mine a little bit longer than my actual waist measurement so that I could just overlap the ends by an inch, and then I added a plastic snap fastener to where that overlap is, and I personally find the plastic snaps to be the most secure, and it's easy to add one further along if you need it to be smaller later or anything. And with that, the skirt is almost done. So there's actually a bit of beading that is going to go right at the top of the skirt, plus some hook and bars, etc. But I didn't do that until after the beading on the bodice so that I could make sure it's all lined up correctly, so I'm not going to go over that part now, but I will be including it in my other video about the bodice. Other than that, that's it for this tutorial. So hopefully that was helpful, but any questions, feel free to comment below and I'll do my best to help out. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for the accessories, which is coming next, hopefully soon.